You know, I'll do my best to be out of here and give you your full 15 minutes because you deserve that. But back on holy ground here, I want to share with you a quote that I wanted to share last hour and didn't get to. But this is a very interesting quote by John Adams. Look at this. Our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Let that one sink in. This is John Adams speaking, by the way. You know, he's one of the big ones. You know, do you realize there were almost 250 different founding fathers? And yet we tend to focus on just the very few that are out there. But John Adams tells us what the Constitution was made for. It's only made for a moral and religious people. Wholly inadequate for the government of any other. All right, let's keep moving forward. There's another scripture here I want to use on this particular study. We're going to be focusing this time on our Christian foundations. But Judges 2:10 says this, and this is one of those ones that is kind of a concern when you think about it. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, in other words, they had died off, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. Essentially what happened was the Israelites forgot their own history. And when they forgot their history, they forgot God as being part of their history. And so they got into a cycle. If you ever study the book of Judges, you see the cycle. They have a period of repentance. They have a period of where they're just locked in solid behind God. And then they have a period where they start falling away. And then they have a period where they totally forget and rebel. And then they have a judge comes in and helps save the day, and they go right back to it. And the cycle repeats. I hope this generation is not the generation that is the last American generation. I fear that. I'll be honest. I really fear that for our country. Will Americans survive past 2050? I don't know. But if America survives past 2050, I don't think it'll look anything like the America that I grew up in or knew. You know, and that America was America that was very proud. It was America that did see itself as being different from other nations. You know, that's why the Olympics are such a special time, you know, because it's not about winning a competition. It's about saying, you know what, we've always been exceptional in certain things. It's not athletes, it's how we condition our athletes, right? Our athletes are just better conditioned. Our athletes are just are better because we have the science and stuff like that. That was the thing that impressed the Indians when they met Lewis and Clark. They were completely impressed with the technology that was on board the barge. Lewis and Clark, after they would have their little powwow with all the Indians and explain the conditions of why they were coming upriver, they would take the Indian chiefs over onto the barge and they'd show off. They had an air cannon. That was the newest technology of the day, was an air cannon. You didn't have no gunpowder to fire. It was fired totally by air. But when it went off, it went boom. And the Indians were like, wow, that was very impressive technology. They'd never seen anything like that. It actually shot a cannonball, they said almost 200 yards. But the accuracy of it was way off. You just never knew where it was going to land. So it wasn't used that much for accuracy's sake. Anyway, I think it's important that we remember our history. Okay, we're going to jump right in with another little video here section by David Barton. And we're going to be looking at our Christian foundations. Let's take a look.
In the classrooms and civil arenas of our nation today, you will find little evidence of the moral and Christian principles America was founded upon. Did our founding fathers intend for us to live in a secular society? Or did the founding fathers believe that Christian principles should be at the center of our government and constitution? And what did they have to say about the separation of church and state? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
We so often hear today that our founding fathers, those who created our nation, were generally atheists and agnostics and deists. And to prove that point, folks will quickly point to Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin, they'll point to Thomas Jefferson and say, see, that proves our point. Doesn't prove anything. We have about 250 founding fathers. You've just selected about 3 of the founding fathers.
250.
250. When you look at founding fathers, signers of the Constitution. We don't exist as a nation without those 55 and their work. Then you move into the first Congress and say, we don't have a nation without the Bill of Rights. That's as important as the Constitution and the Declaration. There are 90 framers who framed the Bill of Rights. That is their collective work. So there's another 90. Then you say, well, we have some folks that didn't necessarily sign any document, but they're huge. John Jay did the Federalist Papers, the original Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Patrick Henry didn't sign the documents, but you just don't have the revolution and the victories we had in Virginia without him. So put them all together, you get about 250 founding fathers. The trouble we have is we've been taught to recognize 2, 3, 4, 5 names. Now, who's ever heard of someone like Dr. Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration? He's one of the ratifiers of the Constitution. He served in 3 different governmental administrations. We don't hear of him, though. He died in 1813. The other founders still alive. John Adams, Thomas Jefferson said he's one of the top 3. He's one of the 3 most notable founding fathers. They said you get Ben Franklin, George Washington, and Benjamin Rush. We've never heard of him today. Who's heard of James Wilson? Who's heard of folks like Stephen Hopkins or Richard Henry Lee or George Clinton or John Dickinson, or we just go through the other names of the signers of the Declaration? We haven't heard them. And because we think we know 2 or 3, we say that's how they were all irreligious. That's nonsense. About 95% of these guys were Orthodox Christians, very outspoken on their faith.
I think what we're debating here and what we're talking about today is that probably 95% of the founding fathers were Christians, believers, that were getting their faith from the Bible.
That's right.
But history doesn't paint it that way. Why not?
Well, history did paint it that way. History has changed over time. As a matter of fact, if you look at our history textbooks today and look to see who we're going to talk about in history, it will be Ben Franklin, it will be Thomas Jefferson. You might have James Madison in there. You're going to have a little George Washington in there, but that's as far as it goes. Now, if I were to take a history textbook from a previous generation, this is a textbook from 1848 that's been reprinted. But this is called The Lives of the Signers of the Declaration of Independence. It is a biography of each of the 56 signers of the Declaration. For generations in America's schools, we studied every one of the signers of the Declaration. We used to know every one of the 56. And so today, the ones we know were largely irreligious, and so we say, oh, founding fathers would not have wanted religious expression in public affairs. The courts are exactly right to say that we can't have these public religious expressions because that's the way the founders were. Well, you've chosen the 2 least religious founders. You've made everyone know the 2 least religious founders. We used to know the other 54 who were very evangelical, quite frankly, in so much of what they did, and we don't hear a thing about them anymore. Today's pseudo-historians, not willing to let truth or historical facts stand in the way of their personal secularist convictions, declare just the opposite, asserting that neither our nation nor its leaders were influenced by Christianity. For example, this article declares, our founding presidents were not Christians. This article similarly announces, the founding fathers were not Christians. Notice the emphasis on the word not. This article proclaims that the signers of the Declaration were enemies of Christ. And the LA Times heralds America's unchristian beginnings with an inset box declaring the founding fathers, most, despite the preachings of our pious right, were deists who rejected the divinity of Jesus. In short, according to these and many other writers, our founding fathers were a collective group of atheists, agnostics, and deists. They didn't believe in Jesus. They weren't Christians. After all, if you look at the painting of the signers of the Declaration, who are the 2 founders that all Americans can immediately recognize? Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, of course. But wait, don't stop there. Which one is Samuel Huntington? Or Robert Livingston? Or George Clinton? Or Robert Morris? Or Stephen Hopkins? Or Richard Henry Lee? Or George Reed? Or Roger Sherman? Or Elbridge Gerry? Or the others? Isn't it interesting that we've been trained to recognize the 2 least religious founding fathers, Franklin and Jefferson? We don't know the others, but we're told that they were just like Franklin and Jefferson. Actually, in defense of Franklin and Jefferson, while they are the 2 least religious founders, least is a comparative term. They are the least religious of the group, but even they're more religious than most religious individuals today. After all, Benjamin Franklin recommended Christianity in the public schools in Pennsylvania, and he worked to raise church attendance across the state. He also made one of the nation's most forceful defenses of religion when it was attacked by Thomas Paine, the author of the infamous Age of Reason. And it was Franklin, citing numerous Bible verses to prove his point, who called for the establishment of chaplains and daily prayer at the Constitutional Convention. And these are the documented actions of one of the least religious founding fathers. And then there's Thomas Jefferson. Not only did Jefferson recommend that the Great Seal of the United States depict the Bible story and include the word God in the national motto, but as president, Jefferson negotiated treaties with the Indians in which he included direct federal funding to pay for Christian missionaries to evangelize the Indians. And these treaties were ratified by the U.S. Senate. Furthermore, Jefferson closed presidential documents with the appellation, "In the year of our Lord Christ," thus invoking Jesus Christ into official government documents. Well, you know, I have a lot of fun with Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin because people think they know those two, but you take those two and they're clearly the least religious of the signers of the Declaration. And by using their original documents, they look like a couple of radical right, Bible-thumping evangelicals. I mean, and they're the least religious. And I'll give you a great example. We moved into the U.S. Capitol in 1800, in November of 1800. And when we moved in, one of the first acts of Congress was to approve the use of the Capitol as a church building. You'll find that in Records of Congress, December the 4th, 1800. Now, who did that? Well, you had the head of the Senate and the head of the House that did it. Speaker of the House was John Trumbull. The president of the Senate who approved that was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson approves church in the Capitol. Yep, he went there as vice president. He went to the church at the Capitol for 8 years as president. And as president of the United States, he's going to church, and this is recorded in all sorts of members of Congress, the records of ours, because they went to church at the Capitol too. And so Thomas Jefferson, President of the United States, thinks, you know, I think I can help the worship services at this new church at the U.S. Capitol. And they met in the hall of the House of Representatives. So Jefferson ordered the Marine Corps band to come play the worship services and the church services at the U.S. Capitol. So the worship band is the Marine Corps band, and a pretty good worship band you had. Thomas Jefferson did. I thought he wanted separation of church and state. If you read his letter on separation of church and state, he said separation of church and state, he makes it very clear, separation of church and state will keep the government from stopping a public religious activity.
So history is basically just cited 6 examples or 5 examples.
They'll take a handful of examples.
They'll take a few of the founding fathers.
Basically, we have learned to recognize the least religious, or at least those founding fathers where you can raise a question about their faith. And so we'll raise it. Why is it that everyone loves to use James Madison? Well, James Madison they now call as one of the great founding fathers. That's because one of the very last things he did before he died was he came out with a writing called the Detached Memoranda. In that writing called the Detached Memoranda, he says, I know that I was on the committee that appointed the original chaplains for Congress, and we paid those chaplains. I now think that was a mistake. I don't think we should have had chaplains. He says, I know I issued a bunch of religious proclamations while I was president, calling the nation to days of prayer and fasting and prayer and thanksgiving. I now think that was a mistake. I shouldn't have had any days for it. So what happens is Madison's now a good guy in the secular mindset because he's got this detached memoranda that he wrote late in life where he renounced all of his religious activities. So you go his whole life, he's very outspoken, he's very religious, he promotes religion, he does treaties promoting religion, and into life he says, I think I made a mistake on everything. So we'll learn about Madison. Now, we're not going to learn about people like John Quincy Adams. We're not going to learn about what Jefferson actually did because we've got a couple of his phrases where we can say he didn't like religion.
Right.
So we're not going to look at the fact that in 1803, Thomas Jefferson, President of the United States, signer of the Declaration, did a treaty with Kaskaskia Indians where that he gave federal funds to send missionaries to the Indians, ratified by the U.S. Senate. Now, I don't know anybody on the radical religious right that would be comfortable doing that today, but Thomas Jefferson did. It was not a problem for him. So we look at the guys today, and we look only at what appears to be their non-religious or anti-religious side, and we think that's who they are. And you look at the rest of Jefferson, and he would make most Christians today look embarrassingly shallow, and yet Jefferson still had questions about the divinity of Christ, and still so much further in promoting Christian principles. But it's not just Jefferson, it's the other guys we don't talk about.
Get the light here. All right, well that should produce a lot of questions and thoughts. What stood out for you?
250 founding fathers, 95% of them are Christians.
I'd go even higher than that. I'd go higher than that. What we don't realize, and Barton doesn't talk about this, is how significant the Great Awakening. Have you heard of that phrase before? The Great Awakening happened in the 1700s. About 1730 to 1770, 1780 is what's called the First Great Awakening. It was so significant, and it was huge in America. It was so significant that Benjamin Franklin himself wrote a little pamphlet to European parents back in, I think it was 1760s. He wrote a pamphlet, and there were European parents who wanted to send their kids, kind of like your parents did, send their kids over to America to find jobs and to work and to make a new life or whatever. And they were worried about it, and they wanted to know, and Benjamin Franklin stepped in and said, I'll just help assuage their fears. Okay, kind of like he's writing a letter to your folks, okay? And one of the things he says is very interesting. He says, listen, you cannot even find an atheist in America. Everywhere you go, you hear hymns singing, you hear people worshiping, you hear people talking about the scriptures. You see Christians everywhere you go. He even said that you could live and die in America right now and not even meet an atheist. Back then they called them infidels. Not meet an infidel, but an atheist would be someone who didn't believe in God. Thomas Paine is going to be one of the few that's actually going to become, and he's not really an atheist. See, the idea, you know what an atheist is? Atheist does not believe there's a God whatsoever. Thomas Paine still believed in God. He just didn't believe that in the God that the churches kind of promoted. He believed in God kind of fashioned after his own image. Do we have a lot of Christians who do that today? Yeah. So, deism back then, this idea of being a deist, they believed in God, but God was separate, and God wasn't interested in the activities of human beings and all that. So it was a different world. But they were very religious. Benjamin Franklin himself, the only reason he gets tagged as a deist, the only reason, and I'll say that fairly emphatically, because when he was a kid, about 14, 15 years of age, he wrote in a personal journal, I am a deist. I have become a deist. And he was kind of one of these kids that, he's a very deep thinker. Maybe some of you can relate to this. And when he went to church, he just wasn't getting the answers at church that satisfied him. He was somebody that wanted to think more deeply about things, and it really bothered him. Here's what's interesting. We actually define his entire life around spirituality because of that one statement. That's why he gets tagged as a deist, Benjamin Franklin does. But the reality is when you look at Benjamin Franklin late in life, you saw some of the activities that he did. Benjamin Franklin went to church at Christ Church in Philadelphia faithfully every single Sunday. You can go to Christ Church in Philadelphia to this day, go in and sit in the pew of the Franklin family. Would a deist actually go to church like that? He was so enthralled with the preaching of another pastor by the name of George Whitefield. And whenever George Whitefield came to town, he would actually help get that thing going and be behind the evangelistic scene or whatever it is you want to call it. But he built a church building for Whitefield. Built a big dome for him to come in and work. That eventually became the first building for what we call now the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. See, so Benjamin Franklin did a lot of that. The coup d'etat is that he is buried outside of Christ Church. If you go to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, go to Christ Church, you go into the cemetery right next door, and you will find him and his family all buried there. Now, would a deist do that? No. In fact, Thomas Paine, let me tell you what happened to Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine basically got captured by the philosophy of the French Revolution. The French Revolution in the late 1700s was counter to everything going on with the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening was awakening people to this idea of God and Jesus and kingdom. And I mean, the revivals were amazing at that time. They talk, if you read some of the histories on the Great Awakening, it's just absolutely amazing. Second Great Awakening as well, which happened in the 1800s. But in France, they were having an awakening themselves. They called it the French Enlightenment, okay? It was called the Enlightenment period. And Thomas Paine went over to France, and he was kind of on the run. He came over, he grew up in England, as I recall, and went over to America, was only here in America for about, 15 years, maybe a dozen years. and then got disenchanted and went home. Went back to England. But when he got to England, he was writing stuff that was kind of on the edge. And even in English colony, even in their English culture, they were going, you can't say stuff like that and get away with it. He said, fine, I'll go to France. And he did. He goes down to France and becomes great friends with all these French enlightened, very open-minded French people and such, philosophically speaking, and starts to doubt, this idea of God and who God is. Now, he never comes to the point where he says there is no God. Can we be clear on that? This idea, when you hear that there were atheists in the founding era, that is dead wrong. There were no atheists in the founding era. What there were people who maybe doubted that God existed, or they had doubts about how God maybe worked in the culture, but they never denied that there was a God. Thomas Paine never denied God. But Thomas Paine wrote a book while he was in France called The Age of Reason. And it was a defense, his own defense. And he was writing about why he had struggles with God and why there's issues with God and why the churches out there are all wrong about God and just on and on, Age of Reason. When he gets it done, he goes back to America and he wants to print it in America. And to a T, almost every founding father, the major players, guys like Dr. Benjamin Rush, Thomas Jefferson, others like Madison, these guys all went to him and said, you do not, I mean, there's an exact quote where Rush says, Benjamin Rush says to him, do not print this. Do not print this. It's going to end any influence. This is the reason why Thomas Paine is so important to American history is because he was what really helped spark the American Revolution. You understand that? If we don't have Thomas Paine in there writing another book that he wrote was called Common Sense. He wrote that book. It inspired the American Revolution. It really would put a fire underneath the revolutionaries to do what they did. But he denied. He denied a lot of the stuff that was going on in churches. And in the end, he wrote this book, Age of Reason. He went against everything he was told to do, and it basically backfired on him. It exactly happened what they said would happen to him. He was exiled in his own country. America basically put him over on the, Americans said, we're not going to read this. This is garbage. This book is garbage. We don't believe this. We're Christians. This is garbage. Literally exiled the guy, culturally exiled. They canceled him. That's what we would call it today. They canceled Thomas Paine, the deist, all right? Put him over there. Here's what's interesting. He dies. He literally becomes a drunk and dies a drunk. And after he dies, they go to try to find a place to bury him. Because back then, you got buried at churches. Wherever you went to church, you got buried at that church. No church would bury him. No church would take his body. So Thomas Paine, okay, wow, what are you going to do with him? One of his friends says, well, let's just bury him on his own land. And so they did. They went and they found a little plot on his own land. They buried him and forgot about him. And literally, that was the end. There were only 6 people who showed up for his funeral. None of the founding fathers showed up for his funeral. Just 6 people showed up. The end of the story that's really interesting to me is about 10, 12 years later, a friend from England comes over to America and asks about his body. And he wants to give Thomas Paine a proper burial in England, because that's where he was from. And so he digs up his bones, puts his bones in a little box, takes them back to England. And he can't find a church in England that will bury him. So these box of bones end up in this guy's closet, and they've been lost to history ever since. We have no idea what happened to us. Isn't that interesting? Here's a guy that was, one of the founding fathers who sparked the revolution with his writings. And in the end, even his bones met the end of in a closet somewhere. And yet you look at these other founding fathers, they're not going to hear these same type of fates. They were Christian. All right? Anything else come out for you? Yeah.
Is there a point in history that you know of where our leaders stopped having Christian values and morals?
Yeah. I think it 1962. If I look at, I can draw a straight line to 1962. When we took prayer out of school, and the next year we took Bible readings out of school, basically from that point forward, we started to create a secular culture. And by the time we got to the 1980s, with the millennial generation growing up in the 1980s and 90s, that culture started to shift even more. The media started to shift. Everything started to shift at that point, And up to that point, you had every morning you would get up, you would say a prayer at school, a little general prayer, and then you'd pledge allegiance to the flag. Do you guys do that anymore? Yeah.
How do you think social media and technology is changing our history and our politics?
Well, social media's had a big impact on our perceptions of things. The problem with social media is that you can have falsehoods, false news, false press, all that stuff. So it's a major thing. But again, what it does is it opens up the opportunity for you to learn new things that might be true. We're going to talk about the Mormons on Thursday. They're a good example of this. A lot of Mormons right now are leaving Mormonism. A lot of young Mormons are leaving Mormonism because of the internet. They've gotten on the internet and they started learning about their faith and went, whoa. Because for years, Mormons were able to keep their Mormons pretty much in the fold and tell them only what their kids needed to know. But when the internet comes along, it opens it up. And that's where I have hope. As long as there's the internet, I love the internet. Because as long as there's the internet, I can write these things. I wrote a whole column on Thomas Paine. I write a column for Boise called Christian Living Magazine on faith, culture, and history. And I spotlight a different one of these guys every single month for them. And I've just learned so much about the history of our country that I didn't know. Yeah.
So you touched on it like a little bit, but I just wanted to ask if you could go into like more detail maybe on how did the Great Awakening or like that revival affect our government and our culture in the time that it happened? You said like the 1700s, right?
Right.
And how do you think a revival similar to that would affect our culture or our government?
I think just like what's going on in Asbury right now with the college kids, it changes things. The Great Awakening really created the Christian America that you're going to learn about here now. The foundations of America. These men, when they got in and gathered around to create a Declaration of Independence, a U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights, those founding documents, they were using as source works the Old and New Testament. You can literally look at our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence as well and draw direct lines to Bible verses. They're very spiritual documents. But we don't hear them that way. We hear them as, they're secular documents. I'm going, really? No, we need to understand where their sources were. It is interesting that of all the books that were sourced and all the influences that were sourced to the U.S. Constitution in particular, the number one source was the Bible. Not another person. A lot of people like to point to other people out there that may have influenced, but it was really just it was Christianity, and it was the Old and New Testaments. Yeah. Here's an interesting quote from Dr. Franklin. This was at the same. You mentioned that where he talked about it. We've delivered to you a republic if you can keep it. He said this at the same time. He said, I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see for this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men, and if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings that except the Lord build, they labor in vain that built it. Interesting. This is a deist speaking, right? Someone who doesn't believe in God. How about this? Let's listen to Benjamin Franklin talk about his faith. As to Jesus of Nazareth, my opinion of whom you particularly desire, I think the system of morals and his religion as he left them to us is the best the world ever saw or is likely to see. That's what Benjamin Franklin thought about Christianity. Now, he did struggle in his faith, even to the end. One of the things he struggled with was going to church. He liked to stay home from church and study the Bible. That's what he did. He didn't stay at home and watch a ball game on TV. He stayed home and literally studied the Bible instead of going to church. We don't hear that part of the story either, but he preferred to actually stay at home. Let's look at James Madison here for a second. James Madison said this. He says, it is impossible for the man of pious reflection not to perceive in it the finger of that almighty hand which has been so frequently and signally extended to our relief in the critical stages of the revolution. So he essentially saying there that when we look at the American Revolution, we find that it was the finger of God that was part of it. And when you study the American Revolution, we should never have won that war. You do realize that. That was a war that we should never have won. The British Empire was huge. In fact, at that time, they said the sun never set on the British Empire. They had the best navy in the world, the British did. And we fight the American Revolution, and then 10, 12 years later, we fight the War of 1812. Who's that against? The British again. Yeah. This doesn't end the British. All this does is satisfy our demand that we want to be a nation of our own. But James Madison said, when you look at the story of the American Revolution, you see God all the way through it. And I don't even have time to tell you those stories. There are all sorts of stories where God shows up. One of the battles was very interesting. They should have lost this battle. They were overwhelmed. They were under. When you looked at the British on one side and you look at the Americans on the other side, there's no way they should have won. No way they should have won. They were outmatched 10-1 type of thing. And this was the British Army. We were hunting with we were shooting with squirrel guns, and they had the best muskets, and they were well trained. And God had some fun with them on that particular day. This battle that we were going to have would have slaughtered them. God sent in a dense fog.
That's what I'm thinking of.
There was a dense fog that fell, and the British couldn't see a thing. And when the fog lifted, all the Americans were gone.
And they also were
They just
trapped on an
vanished.
island.
They were trapped. They were trapped on an island. That's right. You know the battle. Yeah, they were trapped on an island. It's an amazing story. George Washington crossing the Delaware. You know, that was an amazing story. They're just over and over you see these. How about Jefferson? Jefferson was a deist, right? Well, Jefferson did have some deism in him, which basically, again, he believed in God. He struggled a lot with Christianity. He did. There is some examples of that in his writings. But I got to tell you, just like Barton said there, he helped start the church in the Capitol. You realize the U.S. Capitol for decades had church services every single Sunday in the House of Representatives, where you watch the State of the Union address with all the nice, that was full of people. It was the largest place in the state, in the Washington, D.C. to actually hold church. And people would come from all around, and presidents would go, legislators would go. They all would go to church on that particular, on Sunday. Mr. Jefferson made this comment that I think is very interesting. He says, I'm a real Christian, that is to say a disciple of the doctrines of Jesus Christ. Now, just for a moment, we can argue that he struggles with how different churches did their things. Do you struggle with that, by the way?
Yep.
A lot of us do. We struggle with the. Jefferson did the same thing, but he said it's still the best. If there is a religion that's the best, it's a religion to follow. It's Christianity. That's why he sent mission dollars to the Kaskaskia Indians there.
Who was the one who established church services in the Capitol?
Jefferson. Yeah, and you don't hear these stories. All you hear about Jefferson was that he was a deist and he didn't believe in God, and he was, those are the two big ones, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine. But when you get beyond that, all the rest of these are devout Christians. Do you hear me? So I would argue, Barton basically says that Jefferson and Franklin are kind of the least religious. I would argue the opposite. I think that they were fairly religious. They weren't just churchgoers like everybody else. Well, let's watch one more here, and then we'll close for the day.
Which has recently been reprinted, was used in our classroom for generations. It not only provided a brief biography of each of the 56 signers of the Declaration, but it was quite candid about the strong religious faith of many of them. For generations, we knew our founders, and we knew their strong religious beliefs. Well, in return to the spirit of these earlier school books, let's examine some of the religious beliefs held by the founders depicted in these paintings. Let's begin here with the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Congress approved the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, but it was not signed until August the 2nd of that year, and during that intervening month, some of the founders who had voted for the Declaration were called away to the service of their country before they could actually sign the Declaration. For example, George Clinton voted for the Declaration on July the 4th, but before he could sign it, he was called to assume military leadership in New York. And even though Robert Livingston was on the 5-man committee charged with authoring the Declaration, he was recalled to serve in the state legislature before he could sign the very document he had helped draft. On the other hand, some of the 56 who signed the Declaration on August the 2nd had not been in Congress on July the 4th to vote for it, including Matthew Thornton, Thomas Stone, and Francis Lightfoot Lee. So, every individual in this painting, whether by voting or by signing, in some way contributed to the Declaration. Now, what are their religious beliefs? Let's begin with John Witherspoon. He was an ordained minister of the gospel and had several published books of gospel sermons, and was responsible for 2 American editions of the Bible, including this one from 1791. This Bible is considered America's very first family Bible. The Reverend Dr. Witherspoon wrote the introduction for this Bible, and even though the Bible's text is generally the text of the King James Bible, it does not carry that title. After all, the Americans, including Dr. Witherspoon, had just fought a war to be free of kings. So why would they herald the name of a king on this American edition of the Bible? This Bible, therefore, describes itself only as the Holy Bible, because as Dr. Witherspoon pointed out, this was God's word, not the word of any mere king. John Witherspoon, signer of the Declaration and minister of the gospel, is responsible for America's very first family Bible. This man is Charles Thompson. Charles Thompson was the Secretary of Congress, and he and John Hancock were the only 2 founders to sign the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. Charles Thompson is the founder responsible for an American edition of the Bible. This Bible is called Thompson's Bible, named for Charles Thompson, and it is the first translation of the Greek Septuagint into English. It took Charles Thompson 25 years to complete this translation, but even today, this work by one of our founders is still considered one of the more scholarly American translations of the Bible. Now, I have fun with this guy right here because this is, everybody recognizes John Hancock, right? We know John Hancock, no question about Hancock. This is one of 24 prayer proclamations he did for his state. He overtly calls on the people to acknowledge Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. This is even a proclamation for a day of prayer and fasting. He's having the people of Massachusetts pray and fast that if someone does not know Christ, that they will come to know Christ. Now, that's a governor. That's one of our signers of the Declaration. Now, let's not talk about Hancock. Let's talk about Jefferson. So this is a problem we have. We have so many other founding fathers like John Trumbull. Now, John Trumbull, he's governor. He issues proclamations. This proclamation is, we need to take up collections across the state for the Society of Missionaries who are preaching the gospel. So you got the state taking up collections for missionary societies, and we're told, oh no, they didn't want religious activities in public affairs. Nonsense. Absolute nonsense. The problem is we don't talk about these guys.
The bottom of that says God for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
That's right.
Isn't that something?
It's very clear to them. It's very outspoken over. We don't know that history, so we tolerate a level of secularism they never would tolerate. This man is Dr. Benjamin Rush. When he died in 1813, the newspapers of the day and the other founders who were still alive declared that Dr. Rush was one of our 3 most notable founding fathers, ranking him in prominence along with George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. Yet who today has heard of Benjamin Rush, or who knows of his accomplishments? Benjamin Rush was a leading educator, helping start 5 universities and colleges, including the first college for women. Additionally, he's called the father of American medicine. He personally trained 3,000 students for their medical degrees, and he made numerous medical discoveries which still benefit us today. He was also a founder of America's first abolition society, and for 40 years he was a national leader in the abolition movement. In relation to his faith, today we still benefit from his labors. For example, in 1791, Dr. Benjamin Rush founded the Sunday school movement in America. He started what was called the First Day Society, which has grown into today's Sunday schools. And in addition to starting Sunday schools, Dr. Benjamin Rush also started America's very first Bible Society. Here is the original constitution for that first Bible Society. This constitution is authored by Dr. Benjamin Rush himself. In this constitution, Dr. Rush lists 2 very important reasons why America needed Bible societies. First, he pointed out that with the Bible, every individual could discover how to have a personal relationship with God through Jesus Christ. And second, he argued that if every individual owned a Bible and would just study and obey it, that all of our social problems, including crime, slavery, etc., would diminish. As Dr. Rush explained, it is in living by the Bible that man becomes both humanized and civilized. In looking for ways to print Bibles faster and for less money, Dr. Rush and the Society came across what was called stereotype printing, an early form of mass production. The result was that, with the help of President James Madison, and in an act passed by Congress in this building, Dr. Rush's Bible Society obtained stereotype plates by which they could mass produce Bibles. This is the result. America's very first mass-produced stereotype Bible, and it came about through the efforts of Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And there are so many other signers of our founding documents with overt Christian declarations. Consider the words of Declaration signer Samuel Adams, who declared,
I rely upon the merits of Jesus Christ for a pardon of all my sins.
And Robert Tree Payne declared,
I am constrained to express my adoration of the author of my existence, in full belief of his forgiving mercy, revealed to the world through Jesus Christ, through whom I hope for never-ending happiness in a future state.
Consider next Charles Carroll of Carrollton. Charles Carroll was the final surviving signer of the Declaration. He was the last of the 56 signers to pass away, died in 1832 at the age of 95. I hold here one of his original letters, this one written on his 89th birthday. Notice the strong and unequivocal declaration of his Christian faith.
On the mercy of my Redeemer, I rely for salvation, and on his merits, not on any works that I've done in obedience to his precepts.
A bold declaration, but not surprising, for in other of his writings, Charles Carroll explained that his faith was one of the chief reasons that he had entered into the American Revolution. He was fighting to preserve religious liberty. In fact, he was so committed to Christianity that he built and personally funded a Christian house of worship. Charles Carroll's life and words confirm that he was a strong, outspoken Christian, and he is one of the handful of Americans who has been honored here at the Capitol with a statue located in East Central Hall. This man is Francis Hopkinson. He was a church music director and a choir leader, and he is responsible for this work from 1767. This is one of the earliest printed hymnals in America. It took the 150 psalms and set them all to music so that we could sing the psalms just like King David did thousands of years before. Interestingly, this is also one of the earliest music books in America to include musical notation and to place the notes in the staff so you could actually see the melody. And this particular hymn book was the result of founding father and signer of the Declaration of Independence, Francis Hopkinson. Here is Richard Stockton. Like the others in this picture, he pledged his life, fortune, and sacred honor to the cause of American independence, and like the others, he kept his promise. Richard Stockton was captured by the British and, as an American prisoner of war, was tortured and severely abused. Eventually, the Americans were able to arrange for the release of Richard Stockton through a prisoner exchange, but his health was so crushed that he never recovered. Understanding this, he placed his temporal affairs in order and he penned his last will and testament.
I think it proper here not only to subscribe to the entire belief of the great and leading doctrines of the Christian religion, such as the being of God, the universal defection and depravity of human nature, the divinity of the person, and the completeness of the redemption purchased by the blessed Savior, of divine faith accompanied with an habitual virtuous life, but also to exhort and charge my children that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom.
There is no doubt that this founding father, who sacrificed his life for our freedom, was a strong Christian.
So I don't know about you, but I was surprised when I started studying these founding fathers how many of them were actually very devout Christians. Not just Christians, but devout Christians and leaders in their churches and such. It's something to think about. Many of them were pastors, theologians. It's fascinating. All right, guys, I took a little bit, a couple extra minutes. We'll see you tomorrow. Are you enjoying this study? Yes. We'll do it for one more day, and then we'll hit Mormonism on Thursday then, okay? All right, we'll see you. I'm going to go get a beach. Find a beach. Yeah, let's go. Let's go find a beach. Yeah.